Hello guys, so welcome to the first webinar of YOUNGO Cities Working Group. Today we will look at the main outcomes of COP24 and talk about how cities can be more involved as we move toward COP25. For that, I welcome our speaker, Ana Perez-Catala. She's the co-director of Climate Tracker. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
No, thanks to you. It's very nice to be here.
Thank you. Climate Tracker offers one-on-one training, skills development courses, and mentorship to help hundreds of young journalists shape their national climate change debate. It has engaged young communicators with the UN climate negotiation, even with the policymakers. And now, you are an environmental scientist specialized in climate change and development. Very present during the COP, you are also doing the daily climate track, that are very helpful for YOUNGO, and it helps us to understand the ongoing negotiations. Today, you will help us to clarify the main outcomes at COP24 and how city can move and can be more involved as we move toward COP25. I will first of all introduce briefly the topic, and then you can develop your insight about the main outcomes. Also, for you guys who are watching us, you can write comments or questions like on the site, and we will be happy to answer to later. So this year at COP24 in Katowice in Poland, mayors, urban professionals, NGOs, and economists voiced their opinion on the critical role played by cities in addressing climate change. Cities are a key factor in achieving the goals of the National Determinant Contributions, called NDCs, which outline the post-2020 climate action by every country, the increased ambition of the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which is the UN body for assessing the science related to climate change and the Sustainable Goals, SDGs. A new report by the United Nations predicts that 2.5 billion more people will live in urban areas by 2050. Indeed, by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population is expected to live in the urban areas, and this will increase from the current 55%. More striking, this will be valid with close to 90% of this increase taking place in Asia and Africa. So we can understand that cities are a pivotal points in raising ambitions and implementing climate action. During COP24, lots of side events saw participation from organizations like C40 Cities or ICLEI, WWF Cities Work Sustainable Program, UN Habitat, but also YRI, which undoubtedly called attention to this new challenge. Although still in its early days, the discussion about the role of cities has grown since the Paris COP. So we can see that cities are now like a big challenge. But Anna, what were the main outcomes of COP24 then?
Hello, everyone, and thanks. I see in the comments that people are already watching us, so thanks for listening to me. I will try to explain everything that I wrote down that came out of COP. Of course, there's more things that happened, but I'm trying to do a summary. And I will try not to keep it too technical. You know, that's what we try to do in the daily tracks as well. But if I do, please, you can write comments. Here on the side, in your right-hand side, you have a small chat to post questions, and I can try to clarify that and yeah, do it as more understandable as possible. So, you know, Katowice, the COP last year in Poland, was understood to be a key moment, right? Like in 2015, we agreed on the Paris Agreement, but that very important document is a very, very broad treaty. So they spent 3 years from 2015 until now trying to operationalize, to create the guidelines of how to implement the Paris Agreement. And that is what came out of Katowice. So Katowice was really important because when you frame something, when you put the exact details of something, which was the Paris Agreement, it becomes more concrete, more applicable. Therefore, it makes it even sometimes more important than the Paris Agreement itself. So yeah, big thing. So what does it say? Like, there's a final Katowice rulebook, a final text that says something. What is it about? So, for example, I'm sure you've heard about the NDCs, which are kind of the climate plans, the nationally determined contributions. The countries have been presenting them and saying what they will do to reduce emissions, to adapt to climate change. So in this Katowice package, they try to see like how this could look like. So they give ideas, for example, for mitigation, like what are the periods of implementation, what's the scope of this mitigation action, what's the planning process, etc. But these communications in general are not compulsory. So countries will do them if they want to, but it's not something they are obliged to do, which is kind of not a very good point, because we want those documents to be released every X amount of years and then be revised and always be implemented. So then the fact that they are not compulsory, it's a bit disappointing. And then there's the same thing we were saying for mitigation, but it's also for adaptation. So a country can say what are their national adaptation priorities, what support they need in terms of like finance, for example. They can also explain how gender responsive the actions are that they will take, so things like this. And so in general, there's this framework on how these NDCs, these contributions, these climate plans will look like. What it's not clear yet is the time frame that they will have to be, or they can be, because we said it's not compulsory, sent to the UN. So that was one of the fights that was not resolved and that we will see for COP25, which is when do we start having the same time frame to explain or to present the national determined contributions. So that's for, like, let's say, mitigation and adaptation. But then, of course, there's more things. We could explain finance, for example. As you may know, one of the big debates was that developing countries wanted to know in advance how much finance they are going to be provided, so they can plan, like, oh, I'm in a developing country, I actually want to implement this project, but I need to know if I will receive finance and who will give it to me and how and so on. So in the end, the Katowice text says that the developed countries, so the North, has to communicate in advance how much finance they are planning to give every 2 years. So starting 2020, then 2022, 2024, they will have to say how much money they are giving. And also, developing countries who are donors, for example, Mexico is giving money, they are also invited to do that. So they can say, we are also going to give money, we are going to give that much, etc. And then the text also gives some guidelines of what can be in this communication, like, oh, how is this finance balanced between mitigation and adaptation? So how much money is given to mitigation and how much to adaptation? Or how much of that finance, or how we make that finance being new and additional, so that it's not something that we were already giving to, like, build schools and now we're giving to climate change, for example. So all of this is not compulsory, but it's some guidelines that the text gives on how to explain the finance you are giving. And then another major thing for the finance chapter is that it has a process to define when a new higher financial goal will start. So as you know, developed countries and developing countries agreed that at some we would have 100 billion dollars per year from 2020 onwards. But this is not enough to, like, do all the necessary mitigation, all the necessary adaptation, etc. So we need to increase that number, but how to decide that number is very complicated. So there will be a process that will start in 2020 that will help define that. And that was a very big demand by the developing countries to be like, hey, we know that the 100 billion, it's not enough. So how are we going to decide what's a new number? So yeah, that was one of the good takes forward. And then maybe the downside is that any financial scheme can be counted as climate finance. So I'm talking grants, loans, insurances that countries could count as they are giving to developing countries. So yeah, some civil society organizations were very concerned that this would make the 100 billion roadmap like meaningless, and meaning like, oh, if it's a grant, then they will have to give it back and so on. So yeah, I'm trying not to be too technical. This was finance, and then I'm gonna explain like some other small things. First of all, you will see if you look at the text that the biggest chapter by difference is transparency. It took a long time to agree on the transparency guidelines, and they decided in the end that it would be one set of guidelines. So it's the same exactly for developed and developing countries, but it's flexible. So if I am a developing country and I don't have the capacity to do like a very strict set of reporting under the transparency framework, I can explain why I can't do that. So you can explain why you need this flexibility, and then you can not follow all the guidelines, but only some of them. This transparency framework will start in 2024, so still a while to go. But it was like one of the important milestones to explain like how much emissions your country is emitting, what are your adaptation plans, what's your progress towards meeting your climate pledges. These kind of things are under the transparency framework that I just explained. And then one of the topics that was like the most important, or one of the most important at COP, was what was called the global stocktake. So this is a revision mechanism that happens every 5 years to see that the goals that the countries set are enough. And the thematic areas that would include are adaptation, mitigation, and also means of implementation and support, which could can include finance, but also like technology transfer, these kind of things. But they added here considering other issues, which could be loss and damage and response measures. And if you are following the negotiations for a bit, you will know that loss and damage is a very important issue for the Global South. So that was a nice addition in the global stocktake. So what the global stocktake will do is, looking at all these issues, mitigation, adaptation, et cetera, will have three main moments. First, it will gather information on how we are doing at a global level. Then they will do a technical assessment to see like how are we doing, but with like a technical background or scientific information. And then they will consider the outputs. Like we will discuss, oh, maybe this is not enough. Like we have to be more ambitious if we want to achieve 1.5, these kind of things. So these are some of the main chapters that the Katowice text says. Where we've talked about the NDCs being mitigation, adaptation, finance, transparency, and the global stocktake. There's smaller ones. I just wanted to briefly mention two more things. One is the IPCC report. Just before we were talking about it, and it's one of the most important things that happened prior to COP24. And this report had to be somehow linked to the text of the COP, but it was impossible to agree how they would link the science to the UN process, to the policy, we could call it. And that's something that's still like not agreed to, and then that will have to be discussed again this year. So yeah, like how countries were unable to understand or portray the science here, it's one of the downsides of the last COP. And then it happened kind of the same with the Talanoa Dialogue, which was a year-long process that discussed how good were we or not on achieving climate action in line with like science and so on. So they were also unable to link the outcomes of this very open stakeholder process, including cities, including companies, etc. They were unable to link that process that had many voices to the actual negotiations. In the end, the conclusions of this process of the Talanoia dialogue are only noted in the text, which is just like a way to acknowledge that something exists, but it's not binding or strong. So in general, we could say that what lacked COP24 was like strength or ambition. And we can see that through these last two things I explained, how they were unable to link the IPCC or the Talanoia dialogue into it. Okay, I hope this wasn't too long,
No.
and feel free to ask me questions.
Thank you very much for this overview. So like if we just like sum up, so as you say, it's like mitigation, adaptation, finance is a quite important topic and money is driving a lot of the negotiations, transparency framework, which is adaptable, but also it can be tricky at the same time. And then the global stock state, which is quite encouraging. And even if, as you said, it was like a lack of ambition and strength at the same time, but some things were still encouraging. So thank you very much. And like on that thing, can you maybe explain what will be the next main challenges for COP25? So you mentioned the IPCC report on what countries have to agree on, have to agree on. But do you have other main challenges that can be like new at COP25?
Yes, so for COP25, there's quite some work to do still. So first of all, yes, this IPCC report that was not linked has to find a way to be linked specifically to the technology and scientific advice body of the UNFCCC, which is called SAPSTA. But then also some other small things. I mentioned in the beginning that there's not an agreement on how often do countries have to submit their NDCs. And that's what they call a discussion around common timeframes. That is not decided, and that will also be a thing. And then, for sure, one of the important things that I have not mentioned is that at the last minutes of COP24, they were unable to close Article 6, which Article 6 is the market mechanisms that countries can follow to accomplish their goals. And there was some disagreement between the countries, and they decided to postpone the whole negotiation entirely. Like the chapter doesn't say anything; it just says like we will have to agree on this. So COP25 may be very much focused around how do the market mechanisms have to look like, what are the guidelines, all these things. So it can be a very tricky, complicated COP because understanding market mechanisms is something a bit complicated. But yeah, that's one of the things, like the main thing that we can look forward for December this year.
Great, thank you. So lots of work to do more. So if we come back a bit on the city level, so just for you guys, like in preparation of the COP24, the local, regional, and national governments engaged in a worldwide conversation on multi-level with multi-stakeholders climate action through the cities and region Talanoa dialogues. Over the course of 2018, more than 60 cities and regions of Talanoa dialogues were held in 37 countries, of which over 60% happened in the Global South. Launched by ICLI and supported by the Global Task Force, these dialogues marked the start of concerted effort by local governments, regional governments, and their network and partners at multi-level. 80 local and regional leaders from all international networks of local and regional government included the Global Conveyancy of Mayors, C40 City, and the United Nations and local government attended at COP24, which is quite encouraging. Also, we have a lot of work to do because as Mr. Sharif asked at COP24 to the delegates and the participants, he said, as your NDC, so your national determined contribution, is fully capturing major commitments made by the city leader in your country. From the perspective for urban and regional governments, it is important that rules and governing implementation of the NDCs have to be clear and transparent, and that the NDC themselves acknowledge local government action. So following up that, like, in your opinion, Anna, do you think how cities can be more involved at COP, since we saw that it was a very important topic regarding emissions, gas emissions, but also like people are mainly living in cities right now. So where and how cities can be more involved?
Okay, you got a good question. So I agree that definitely cities are very important, especially because if we looked at the biggest chunk of emissions, maybe they would majorly come from cities. So I think there's different ways to look into it. If we would look at it from the national level, I would say, or the regional level, regions or countries could look into what cities are doing to be part of the NDCs. That includes some like cross level cooperation that sometimes doesn't happen, but that would be a very good conversation to have. And if you are working like pushing for ambition in a specific level of government, you could ask like, hey, but are you coordinating with the others, for example? But then within the UNFCCC space, for the last years, we have seen how they are trying to increase the participation of non-party stakeholders, what they call it. I think in a way it's because they are not seeing enough ambition from national governments, from parties itself, and they are trying to bring companies, civil society, and cities or regions to show that there's ambition happening. So I think showcasing that things are happening is important, and it has a one of the important roles at COP, right? Like people go to see the site events and take ideas, especially if you're not involved in the negotiation process. When I meet people from my local government or like regional government, they do make that and they like interact with each other, give each other ideas. That's very positive. But I'd say they have to be given a better voice to push for ambition. So that can be, for example, through the UN Secretary General summit happening in September, where different actors will show what they are doing to fight climate change. But also maybe different countries could give different voices to cities inside the delegations, or let them influence or let them participate better than they do. Because if that specific city is driving change or is driving more action, then they should be the ones also pushing for the government to do more at a national, but also at an international level.
Great. So being present is important for cities.
It is.
To push forward. Great. Maybe we can answer to some questions, because I see there is few of them. So maybe we can begin by Sophia's one. She has a question related to the link between scientific community, when we mentioned IPCC report, and policymakers. Do you think NGOs could bridge this gap?
So I do think that policymakers who understand them as like governments and so on, sometimes they don't know how to use all the science. We were discussing the other day that there's too much science. Now we need think tanks that summarize the science, so policymakers know which one to use, because there's so much around there, which is a very good job that the IPCC does, but maybe also more locally. NGOs can do that, yes. So many NGOs, for example, when the IPCC 1.5 report came out, like summarized it or gave like the main messages, and that is important for like a local government or like a regional government. You know, they don't have the capacity if not. But I'd say sometimes NGOs then they are seen as like biased. So I'm not sure if they would always be taken seriously because they have an agenda. So I think there's a big role also, I mean, for like main messages, like I don't know, IPCC at 1.5 tells us that we have to reduce emissions to zero by 2050, kind of thing. I think that's pretty like society-wide, like we play a role as youth, think tanks, but organizations, like everyone. But when it's more like concrete science for specific things, I think like bigger like think tanks and all these kind of analyses that have like the credibility, I think they are really important for that. I'm not sure if I'm answering fully the question. Just get back to me if you need.
That's some insight. It's great. We need it. Also, there is Joanna who is asking what happened to the Ratchet mechanism increasing ambitions to NDCs every 5 years. Has the discussion on common time frame changed this?
Okay, that's a very good question, Joanna. So the Ratchet up mechanism kind of exists, but it doesn't at the same time. So the only thing they agreed for now is that the common timeframes for all countries will be implemented from 2030 onwards. That means that now until 2030, maybe it's solved this year already, countries will discuss how these common timeframes look like. And then they will start implementing it 2030. So what happens between 2020 and 2030, these 10 years, it's unknown. I'd say this is because countries like the European Union have targets that are 10 years. So therefore, if the Paris Agreement starts to be implemented in 2020, then in 2030, they will present the second NDC. But there's countries that have it at 5 years, as you know. So maybe what they will just do is allow this flexibility for the first round and then see what happens. I would still hope that from 2030 onwards, it's every 5 years, but that's not decided. So it's a bit broad still.
Okay, thank you. And there is a last questions of Atto, who is asking for cities, how can we press for more involvement in a down-bottom approach to start with the local cities determine contribution? I don't know if you want to answer this one too.
Sure, but I'm sure you would have insights as well.
Yeah, I can maybe complement later. No worries.
Okay. I mean, that depends very much on your context, but in my country, for example, I would be able to like have meetings with them, have an influence. So especially if you're part of an organization or a movement that it's having a voice because of the specific moment that country is living. For example, now with Fridays for Future, governments are more inclined to like show that they really care about young people saying something about climate change. So that would be a very good opportunity to like, I don't know, demonstrate in front of the city council and then have to meet with someone or ask for a meeting with someone. And then be like, why you don't have a plan to do this? That has worked for, like in my experience in the past, but it can also be that depending on your context, you don't have that much access to power, which sometimes the UNFCCC is good for that. Like when you are at the UN space, they kind of listen to you differently because you're already there. So you can try both things. But what do you think, Valentin?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I will say, like, as you said, like demonstrations are first of all like the good like way to show to your council and cities that you on the day push forward that issue, but also public awareness, raising public awareness is a good thing to create more ambitions toward the civil society. And as much as you can share and talk, share the knowledge that you have and talk to people to create again awareness. And as you previously mentioned, Anna, being present as you as a YOUNGO or as a city, if you really want to be involved, like trying to work on it, because we all know that it's going to be, it's a common issue. So we all have to work on that. So yeah, this is what I would like to say, I think. So maybe we can like soon wrap up the webinar, but I would have like if you want to add more things, feel free, Anna.
I was thinking if there was something missing that I had to say for the next COP, the one in Chile,
Yeah.
and I think the only thing I missed, and that will start already in Bonn, so if you're planning to be at the Bonn Intersessional, is something that it's called response measures. I'm not sure if many people know about it. But that is a way to present how countries who are very dependent on fossil fuels will diversify their economy or transform it and do it in a way that is just. So that was very important for all the Arab groups, especially Saudi Arabia. And it was like kind of like a trade-off. Like we give you something on, I don't know, I think it was loss and damage, and we give you something on response measures kind of thing. So the first forum that will discuss response measures, it's this June. So this June is gonna be very fun as well, because we will have this response measures thing, then the IPCC discussion that they just didn't agree. We will have what was it? Yeah, of course. And then the conflict of interest discussion that always gets postponed every June. So between June and December, I think we can have some fun seeing how countries try to agree with these last bits.
That's great. I mean, it's still encouraging to see that countries are trying at least to diversify their economy. And I have a last question. If you could change one thing at COP, what it will be?
Wow. Okay. I would give free food to everyone, but in more like in more meaningful ways. I think that's like a very idealistic thing, but I would give more power to those who don't have it. Speaking about, for example, the small island developing states or the least developed countries, because normally they have like really progressive ideas that would have made even better the Katowice package, but because who in the end have a bigger say are the most powerful countries, those things don't get to be implemented as much. So definitely the imbalance in global power, but that's very difficult to solve.
Okay, that's a good one. So I think we're going to the end of this first webinar. So thank you very much for watching us. Thank you, Anna, for answering positively to our invitation for the first webinar. And I think you gave a great, like you get all the outcomes of COP24, and we are now more aware of what's going on and what's going to be the main challenges for COP25. So thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. And, if you ever have doubts on these kind of things, we don't always have the answers, but we try to. So please reach out if you need. And I wish you all the success with the coming webinars as well. I'm sure they will be very interesting too.
Thank you very much. See you.